Welcome. Tonight we step into the shadowed plantations of Louisiana, 1841, where cruelty wasn't learned, it was inherited. This is the true story of the slave sisters, women born into power who turned domination into sport, leaving 4 families shattered across generations. Records whisper, letters accuse, and court files reveal a violence so normalized it hid in plain sight. As you listen, tell me where you're watching from: city, country, or late night headphones. And if you value stories built on painstaking archival research and verified accounts, please subscribe. It takes countless hours to trace the truth buried beneath silence, and your support keeps these forgotten voices alive. In 1841, Louisiana stood at the heart of the American slave economy, shaped by fertile land, global demand for sugar and cotton, and a rigid racial hierarchy enforced by law. Large plantations along the Mississippi River and its tributaries generated immense wealth for white landowners, while enslaved Africans and African Americans endured brutal labor regimes. Sugar plantations in particular were notorious. Harvest seasons were deadly. Workdays stretched from before dawn to nightfall, and mortality rates were among the highest in the South. This economic dependence on slavery created a society where violence was not an exception, but a tool of productivity. Louisiana's social structure was deeply stratified. At the top sat elite planter families who controlled land, politics, and local courts. Beneath them were smaller slaveholders, overseers, and merchants who benefited indirectly from the system. Enslaved people occupied the bottom rung, legally defined as property under Louisiana's civil code, which blended French, Spanish, and American legal traditions. While the law theoretically imposed limits on excessive cruelty, enforcement was rare, especially when the accused belonged to influential families. Women in planter households held a unique and often overlooked position of power. Though excluded from formal politics, white women, especially daughters and wives of plantation owners, frequently managed domestic enslaved labor and exercised authority over punishment within the household. In this environment, cruelty could be passed down as a normalized behavior, learned early and reinforced by a culture that framed domination as both a right and a duty. For young women born into these families, control over enslaved people was often one of the first forms of power they were allowed to wield. Social silence was another defining feature of plantation society. Neighbors, local officials, and even clergy often knew of abuses, but chose not to intervene, bound by economic interest, racial ideology, or fear of social exclusion. Enslaved families had no legal standing to testify against white owners, making accountability almost impossible. This silence allowed patterns of abuse to continue unchecked, embedding cruelty into daily life and ensuring that acts of violence, no matter how extreme, were absorbed into the normal functioning of Louisiana's plantation world in 1841. Cruelty within the slaveholding South was rarely spontaneous. It was taught, modeled, and reinforced across generations. Children born into planter families grew up watching violence used as discipline, order, and entertainment. From an early age, white heirs, sons and daughters alike, learned that enslaved people existed solely to obey. Punishment was normalized at the dinner table and justified through religion, pseudoscience, and social custom. By adulthood, many no longer viewed brutality as cruelty at all, but as responsibility. Gender shaped how power was expressed, not whether it existed. While men often controlled the fields and business operations, white women wielded immense authority within the domestic sphere. Mistresses supervised enslaved cooks, maids, nurses, and child attendants, exercising daily control over their bodies, movements, and survival. This domestic power was intimate and constant, allowing emotional, psychological, and physical abuse to occur away from public view. Because women were seen as morally refined and less capable of violence, their actions were often questioned less or not at all. For daughters raised on plantations, dominance over enslaved people could become a substitute for freedoms denied to them in a patriarchal society. Unable to vote, own property independently in many cases, or hold public authority, some elite women asserted control through the one arena fully open to them: mastery over human property. This dynamic could intensify cruelty, as punishment became a way to affirm status, command respect, and vent personal frustrations without consequence. Inherited cruelty also thrived because it was rewarded, not punished. A harsh mistress was often praised for keeping order or disciplining properly, while enslaved resistance was labeled ingratitude or rebellion. Stories, habits, and attitudes were passed down like heirlooms, embedding violence into family identity. By 1841, such cruelty was no longer just individual behavior. It was a cultural inheritance protected by race, gender privilege, and a legal system designed to ensure that power, once born into, could be exercised without fear. By the early 19th century, wealth in Louisiana was inseparable from slave ownership, and family status rose or fell with the number of enslaved people controlled. The sisters' ascent began at birth into a household already embedded in the plantation economy. Land, enslaved laborers, and social connections were inherited rather than earned, placing them immediately within the planter elite. As sugar and cotton profits expanded during the 1830s and early 1840s, families like theirs gained increased economic leverage, allowing even younger members, especially daughters, to exercise authority over enslaved people long before marriage or formal adulthood. Education and social grooming further reinforced their position. Elite white girls were taught plantation management basics, household accounting, and supervision of enslaved domestic labor. While male relatives handled land deals and crop sales, women learned how to maintain discipline, maximize productivity within the home, and preserve the family's public reputation. This training was not benign. It included instruction on punishment, surveillance, and obedience. Authority over enslaved people became a marker of competence and maturity, accelerating the sisters' rise as figures of power within the plantation system. Marriage prospects and inheritance laws also played a crucial role. In Louisiana, influenced by civil law traditions, women could sometimes retain control over property, including enslaved people, through dowries or separate estates. As a result, sisters from wealthy families could directly own, manage, or co-control enslaved laborers. This legal access to property elevated their status beyond mere extensions of male authority, embedding them firmly within the economic machinery of slavery rather than on its margins. Their growing control translated into social influence. Overseers deferred to them in domestic matters. Enslaved people were expected to obey without question, and neighboring families recognized their authority as legitimate. Any reputation for harshness was often reframed as efficiency or strength. By 1841, the sisters were no longer passive beneficiaries of the slave economy. They were active participants whose power was reinforced daily by profit, law, and silence, enabling them to act with confidence and near total impunity. On Louisiana plantations in the early 1800s, control over enslaved people relied on a calculated system of fear, surveillance, and physical domination. Punishment was not random. It was structured to enforce obedience and discourage resistance. Whippings were the most common method, administered for perceived disobedience, slow work, or minor infractions. These beatings were often carried out publicly to maximize their psychological impact, sending a clear message that authority was absolute and consequences were immediate. Beyond physical violence, deprivation was a powerful tool. Enslaved people could be denied food, sleep, medical care, or clothing as punishment. On sugar plantations especially, workers already faced extreme exhaustion, making these deprivations even more dangerous. Confinement in small sheds, cellars, or locked rooms, sometimes for days, was used to break the will of those accused of defiance. These practices blurred the line between discipline and torture, yet were widely accepted as management. Psychological punishment played an equally destructive role. Threats of sale were among the most feared methods of control, as being sold often meant permanent separation from family. Masters and mistresses exploited this fear deliberately, using children, spouses, and parents as leverage. Forced witnessing, making enslaved people watch the punishment of loved ones, intensified trauma, and reinforced helplessness, ensuring obedience through emotional devastation, rather than constant physical force. Women in positions of authority often specialized in intimate, domestic punishments that occurred away from public scrutiny. Slaps, beatings with household objects, prolonged standing, forced kneeling, and verbal humiliation were common within the home. Because these acts took place indoors, they were harder to document or challenge. Together, these methods formed a comprehensive system of control, one designed not only to punish the body, but to dismantle identity, family bonds, and any sense of autonomy among the enslaved. Psychological terror was not an accidental byproduct of slavery in Louisiana. It was a deliberate system of governance. Plantation authority depended on keeping enslaved people in a constant state of uncertainty and fear. Rules were often vague or inconsistently enforced, meaning punishment could come without warning. This unpredictability ensured that obedience was internalized. Enslaved individuals learned to police their own behavior, knowing that even minor missteps could provoke severe consequences. One of the most effective tools of psychological control was the manipulation of time and expectation. Enslaved people were kept ignorant of how long punishments would last, when work would end, or whether promises, such as reduced labor or family visits, would be honored. Rewards were frequently dangled and then withdrawn, reinforcing the idea that hope itself was dangerous. This erosion of trust dismantled morale and created a sense of permanent vulnerability, where survival depended on reading the moods and whims of those in power. Public humiliation further reinforced terror. Enslaved people were routinely shamed in front of others, accused of moral failings, laziness, or ingratitude. Being stripped, mocked, or accused publicly served to isolate individuals from their community and crush resistance. Children were often forced to witness these acts, conditioning fear from an early age and ensuring that terror passed seamlessly from one generation to the next. Perhaps most devastating was the systematic destruction of family security. Parents were reminded daily that they had no legal claim to their children, and spouses could be separated at any moment. This constant threat ensured compliance without the need for continuous physical violence. By 1841, psychological terror had become embedded in plantation life, an invisible but ever-present force that governed behavior, silenced dissent, and maintained control even when the whip was not raised. The cruelty inflicted by the sisters did not fall randomly. It was concentrated on specific enslaved families whose labor, obedience, or resistance placed them under heightened scrutiny. On plantations, families were economic units as much as human ones. Parents, children, and extended kin often worked in coordinated roles across fields and domestic spaces. When a single member was accused of defiance, illness, or perceived laziness, punishment frequently extended to spouses, siblings, or children. In this way, entire families became targets, not individuals. These 4 families were bound to the plantation through generations, with roots that stretched back decades. Births, deaths, and marriages were recorded not as personal milestones, but as inventory changes in ledgers and wills. Their long presence made them highly visible and deeply vulnerable. Familiarity did not offer protection. Instead, it allowed the sisters to exploit personal knowledge, knowing which child a mother feared losing, which husband or wife depended on, or which elder held influence within the enslaved community. Targeting families amplified control. Children were assigned labor early, sometimes placed under harsher supervision as a way to discipline parents. Mothers could be punished through their children, extra work, withheld food, or threats of sale, while fathers were forced to watch their inability to protect their households. This strategy ensured compliance while spreading fear beyond the immediate victim, turning family love into a weapon against them. The destruction of these 4 families did not always occur through immediate sale or death, but through slow fragmentation. Forced relocations within the plantation, reassignment to distant labor sites, and selective sales weakened bonds over time. By 1841, the damage was generational. Children grew up without parents, elders without descendants nearby, and family lines were permanently altered. What remained were records and memories that testify to how targeted cruelty could erase not just lives, but entire family histories. Generational trauma was an unavoidable consequence of slavery, especially in cases where entire families were systematically targeted. For enslaved people, trauma did not begin or end with a single act of violence. It accumulated over years and was passed from parents to children through lived experience. Fear, grief, and hypervigilance became survival traits. Children grew up watching their parents punished, humiliated, or powerless, shaping their understanding of the world long before they could fully comprehend it. Family separation was the most devastating mechanism through which this trauma spread. Enslaved marriages had no legal recognition, and children could be sold at the will of an owner. Even when families remained physically together, The constant threat of separation created a climate of emotional instability. Parents avoided forming visible attachments, knowing love could be exploited. This emotional restraint, necessary for survival, often left lasting psychological scars that followed children into adulthood. The trauma deepened when separations actually occurred. Mothers lost children to sales meant to punish or profit, sometimes never knowing where they were taken or whether they survived. Fathers were sent to distant plantations or reassigned to brutal labor, severing daily bonds. These ruptures erased family histories, oral traditions, and support systems, leaving individuals isolated within a system designed to deny continuity and belonging. By 1841, the effects of this trauma were generational. Children raised under terror often carried unresolved fear into their own parenting, shaping how they protected or emotionally distanced themselves from their offspring. The result was not a lack of love, but a forced adaptation to constant loss. This legacy of separation did not end with emancipation. It lingered in fractured family lines, missing records, and the enduring struggle of descendants to reclaim identities deliberately stripped away by slavery. Abuse on plantations rarely occurred in total secrecy. Neighbors, overseers, merchants, and local officials were often aware, at least in part, of the cruelty inflicted on enslaved people. Screams carried across fields, injuries were visible in markets and churches, and patterns of fear were impossible to hide entirely. In plantation communities, rumors circulated quietly, yet acknowledgement rarely translated into intervention. Awareness existed, but it was carefully contained. Economic dependence was a major reason for this silence. Louisiana's local economies were tied directly to plantation profits, and challenging a powerful slaveholding family risked financial ruin or social exclusion. Merchants relied on planter accounts, overseers depended on recommendations, and small farmers sought favor from elites. Speaking out against abuse threatened not only livelihoods, but social standing in a rigid hierarchy, where loyalty to the system mattered more than moral objection. Legal and racial structures further enforced complicity. Enslaved people were barred from testifying against white individuals, and complaints had to pass through courts dominated by the same planter class. Even when extreme cases surfaced, they were often reframed as isolated incidents or justified as necessary discipline. Officials who might privately disapprove still upheld the law as written, choosing procedure over justice and reinforcing the idea that intervention was neither expected nor required. Silence also carried a psychological dimension. Many white community members normalized cruelty as part of the natural order, distancing themselves emotionally from its consequences. Others feared that acknowledging abuse would force them to confront their own participation in slavery, whether as owners, beneficiaries, or passive observers. By 1841, this collective silence had become a form of violence itself, one that protected abusers, erased victims, and ensured that suffering could continue uninterrupted under the protection of community complicity. Louisiana's legal system in the early 19th century offered the appearance of restraint on cruelty, while quietly ensuring that slaveholders remained protected. The state's civil code included vague provisions against the excessive mistreatment of enslaved people, but those terms were undefined and left to the discretion of local authorities. In practice, this meant that nearly any level of violence could be justified as discipline, especially when the accused belonged to a prominent family. The law functioned less as a safeguard for the enslaved and more as a shield for property owners. One of the most significant loopholes was the denial of legal personhood to enslaved people. They could not file complaints, testify against white individuals, or seek legal redress on their own behalf. Any accusation had to be brought by another white person willing to challenge a fellow slaveholder, an act that risked social and economic retaliation. As a result, even well-documented abuse often went unreported or stalled before reaching a courtroom. When cases did surface, accountability was undermined by local power dynamics. Judges, sheriffs, and juries were frequently drawn from the same planter class or were financially dependent on it. Evidence of abuse was dismissed as hearsay, injuries were blamed on illness or accidents, and enslaved witnesses were legally silenced. Punishments, if imposed at all, were minimal, small fines or warnings that carried no real consequence and did nothing to alter behavior. This systemic failure sent a clear message: the law would not interfere with the internal operations of slavery. By 1841, slaveholders understood that the risk of prosecution was negligible, no matter how extreme the cruelty. Legal loopholes did more than enable abuse, they normalized it, transforming violence into a protected practice and ensuring that accountability remained an illusion rather than a reality. Much of what is known about plantation cruelty in Louisiana comes not from personal confessions, but from fragments left behind in official and private records. Court filings, probate inventories, wills and bills of sale provide stark evidence of how enslaved people were treated as assets rather than human beings. In some cases, abrupt changes in valuation, children listed separately, adults marked as damage or runaway, hint at violence, punishment, or forced separation that the documents themselves refuse to describe openly. Personal letters and diaries offer more direct insight, though they must be read critically. Plantation owners and their relatives often recorded daily events without moral reflection, casually referencing whippings, confinement, or threats of sale. These accounts, written for private audiences, unintentionally reveal how normalized cruelty had become. Silence within these writings, what is omitted or minimized, can be just as revealing as what is stated, exposing an effort to present brutality as routine management. Eyewitness records also survive through third parties. Overseers' reports, travelers' observations, church disciplinary notes, and rare testimonies from abolitionists or journalists occasionally captured moments of extreme abuse. While these sources were often biased or incomplete, their convergence across different contexts strengthens their credibility. When multiple accounts align, patterns of behavior emerge that challenge claims of isolated incidents. Perhaps the most fragile but powerful records are oral histories preserved by descendants after emancipation. Though recorded decades later, these memories often match the timelines and details found in written archives. Together, documents and eyewitness records form an incomplete but undeniable historical trail. By piecing them together, historians can reconstruct acts of cruelty that perpetrators assumed would vanish with time, proving that even systems built on silence leave traces that refuse to disappear. After slavery's formal end, Many stories of plantation cruelty were deliberately buried. Families who had profited from slavery rewrote their histories, preserving images of refinement and honor while omitting violence and exploitation. Plantation records were selectively kept, destroyed, or sanitized, and local histories celebrated wealth and architecture without acknowledging the suffering that sustained them. This process of erasure ensured that perpetrators were remembered as respectable ancestors, while victims were reduced to nameless figures or erased entirely. Public memory followed the same pattern. Textbooks, monuments, and regional folklore often portrayed slavery as benign or paternalistic, minimizing brutality and emphasizing loyalty or tradition. The experiences of enslaved families, especially women and children, were excluded from official narratives. This selective storytelling shaped generations of understanding, making cruelty seem like an exaggeration rather than a documented reality. Silence became inherited, just as violence once had been. Modern reckoning has begun to challenge this erasure through scholarship, archival recovery, and descendant testimony. Historians now re-examine plantation ledgers, legal documents, and personal correspondence alongside oral histories to reconstruct suppressed truths. Museums, universities, and community projects are confronting uncomfortable legacies, acknowledging that economic prosperity and social status were built on human suffering. This work is ongoing and often contested, revealing how deeply the past continues to shape the present. Reckoning is not about assigning retroactive guilt, but about restoring historical truth. Naming victims, tracing family lines, and documenting abuse allows descendants to reclaim lost identities and narratives. By confronting what was erased, society gains a clearer understanding of how systems of power operate and endure. Remembering these stories ensures that cruelty is neither romanticized nor forgotten, and that the lives destroyed in 1841 are finally recognized as part of shared history, not hidden footnotes.